Hello and welcome to Season 3 of the NGO Whisperer Show. My name is Carolyne Opinde. I am the founder of the NGO Whisperer and the convener of the NGO Whisperer Masterclass. The NGO Whisperer is a consulting business that provides technical support to nonprofits so they can successfully impact people's lives. Joining us today for part 2 of Peacebuilding in conflict-affected countries is Dr. Theo Hollander. Dr. Theo is a peace-building professional working in Eastern and Central Africa with Interpeace. Dr. Theo, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Carolyne.
You have partnered with a former child soldier, Norman Okello, and Norman Okello was abducted by the Lord's Resistance Army in Uganda. Could you please share with us the whole story? Because you have documented hundreds and hundreds of stories like this. And out of that came a book, The Boy Soldier, a memoir of innocence lost and humanity regained in Northern Uganda. Share with us first and foremost, for those who may not know, what happened, in the story to the point where you partnered with Norman Okello to write this book that was recently published and launched. It's available on Amazon.
Boy Soldier is like Dominic Ongwen's story. It's set in Northern Uganda. And it's about the life of a young man who was abducted at the age of 12. He's actually exactly my age. So these days he probably also has some gray hairs and he's not as young anymore as at the time when the story took place. But he was abducted at the age of 12. He spent 2 and a bit years in the Lord's Resistance Army. He worked himself also up to the rank of a sergeant. And his story is a story about survival. It's a story about trying to keep your humanity when you're in a very inhumane society. It's a story about human resilience, and I think it's a very inspiring story. Just the context of this conflict, there was an armed movement called the Lord's Resistance Army. And from sort of the 90s onwards, the main way that this army recruited people to fight for them was through violent abduction. And it was often young children were abducted, children between the ages of usually 8 up till 16. They were abducted and then they were really brainwashed to become soldiers. At the height of its power, the LRA would have had probably 10,000, 15,000 fighters, the vast majority of whom were young people, children, both men and women, who were completely brainwashed and forced to become soldiers, and often people that really did horrific things in order to survive. So it's actually when I met you the first time. That's when I went for several weeks to Northern Uganda to get a sense of if there was anything that I could do to be meaningful. Then I came back a year later to do my master thesis, which was on reintegration of female combatants who came back with a child from captivity. And Norman was my translator and my mobilizer, and he sort of helped me throughout that research. At some point I did an interview with him, and I really don't know why his story in particular had such an impact on me more than the other stories, but there was something that just triggered it. And the first interview was just in a nutshell, his entire story in like, it was a 2-hour interview. And then I asked him, would you be interested in really documenting this story in depth? Because I told him, I feel that the world needs to know your story. And he thought about it and he said, I really want to do this. And his motivation, I think, was slightly different than mine. His motivation was, I want my family to read this. I want the people of Northern Uganda to read this, to learn what war does to an individual. And he also knew that his story was maybe too painful to tell directly to his children, his grandchildren. So to have it in a book would give his family sort of access to his story without him having to narrate it to them directly. So that was the start of a pretty long journey. Like we started the interview in 2007, we continued in 2008, and we finished in 2009. I did over 60 hours, I think, of interviews with him. In the beginning, I was just trying to get a chronology. So often an hour and a half interview would just focus on one specific episode in the story, often just one day. We would talk a day, like an hour and a half, just about one day in his life when something very significant happened. At some point, we decided to go to all the places, not all, but many of the places where things happen in the story. And we did location interviews. And those location interviews really triggered a lot of his memories that had since been suppressed. And it gives an enormous level of detail and richness in this book. And I've read a lot of books about former child soldiers, and I don't think any of them is as detailed as this one. So his story in a nutshell, he was abducted at the age of 12. He was then, for about 2 months, he was in Northern Uganda while he was being trained. He then went to South Sudan, or at the time it was still Sudan, where the LRA had its safe.
When you talk about training, it's really training them to use the guns and to be violent, isn't it?
So the first time that he had to kill somebody was when he was still in Northern Uganda. It was before he traveled to Sudan, and it was somebody like him, another child soldier who had escaped, and he was taken. So this person, this is a horrible story, by the way, but this person was bound, and then all the new recruits, as they call them, so all the abducted children, were then forced around him, and all of them had to throw stones or club him. Norman himself, he had a gun with a bayonet, and he had to stick a bayonet in this boy. And that's also how the LRA teaches people the cost of escaping. So this is also the psychological warfare that they have against those children. So they say, this is what happens to you when you try to escape. They really believe that Joseph Kony is a spiritual leader that can not only look at you at the outside, but he can see your thought processes. And they really believe that. So even thinking becomes dangerous. Whatever you do in your brain, you try to hide that as much as possible, because there was this fear that Joseph Kony could see this. So then the training that happened, it's sort of a combination between the spiritual training, where you learn about the spiritual aspects of the LRA, and the LRA is a sort of like a religious cult / guerrilla movement. But then it's also training in guerrilla warfare. His initial training was very light touch, but then he was sent for specialized training in artillery. And there he learned about laying landmines, disarming landmines, how to fire mortars, how to fire bazookas, RPGs, etc. And that made him at the age of 13, he was one of the most specialized fighters in his unit. Wow. Which also meant that very often, like any mission that went to Uganda, and the missions were always about like warfare, committing massacres, he was always selected.
At 13-year-old?
At 13-year-old, he was a real hardened soldier. Like what he went through at 13-year-old, most UK soldiers or most Dutch soldiers will never ever experience in their entire life. And there you did not have a tour of duty. It was non-stop. And he was involved in some of the biggest stories of that conflict. Like one of the most well-known story of the conflict is the abduction of the Yaboki girls. So there was the abduction of 140 girls from a girls' school in Lira, so in one of the towns of Northern Uganda. And this story is very famous because after the 140 girls were abducted, there was an Italian nun that went after them, that caught up with this group, and she negotiated with the commander, and she got 109 girls released, and the commander then took the remaining 30. And it was actually Norman that was the first. He was then in charge of what they call the blocking force. So that's the rear guard. And it was Norman that saw this nun the first time and that brought this nun to the commander. So he was involved in that. Like a few missions later, he was involved in a punishment mission in Kitgum, in one of the areas of Northern Uganda, where they committed unspeakable atrocities as a unit. And it was actually during that mission, he had fights with two of his commanders, and there was one commander that always sent him to the most dangerous places. And he knew that that commander wanted to kill him. And the commander actually had tried to kill him several times, but was stopped by higher ranking commanders. So at one point he said, like, he knew that if he was going to stay any longer, he would be killed. So that's when after 2.5 years, he decided to escape. His escape story in and of itself is absolutely amazing. Like it was they were ambushed by the Ugandan army. So it was in the ambush that he managed to get away. He hid in a cave. While he was hiding in a cave, there were two of his soldiers that followed his footsteps because they were looking for him and they wanted to execute him because he escaped. And they followed his footsteps up to the cave. And probably those two boys knew that he was in there, but they also knew that if they would try to get him out, they would both be killed. So they said that they couldn't find him to the commander who was up on the riverbank. And that's how he survived that specific episode. Several days later, they surrounded him when he was cooking a chicken in a hut, and miraculously, like they all shot at him, and he got grazed by bullets, but he managed to escape again. And it's only much later when he talked to several of the people in the units that he found out that a lot of people actually on purpose shot in his direction, but not directly at him. And that's probably the reason why he's alive. There's so many things in that story that it's just absolutely incredible that he's still alive. These are just a couple of examples. And then after his escapes, he surrenders to the Ugandan government. And then you would think like, then that's when he's safe, but then a whole other episode of his story starts. And that episode is, first of all, imprisonment by the Ugandan army, who consider him a rebel, and who want to extract information and almost try to recruit him into their forces. Then at the end, an NGO managed to, like a World Vision, managed to get him released. And then his journey starts to integrate back in society, to live in a society again that fears him, that hates him, and also a society where he's no longer fit to live, because what he learned and what he did in the LRA is like, you need to be tough all the time. You use violence to solve any problem. So he had to unlearn all those learned behaviors when he was back in society. There's one story where, like, he just goes into a classroom because he wants to get educated, and everybody in that classroom is completely petrified by having him there. So society was really fearing him. His parents feared him. His parents did not dare to leave him alone with his other siblings. So it's a really long story, and there's a Frenchman who really, really helped him. Like, he sent him to a school with other former child soldiers. And that school had a really big impact on his healing process. But I was actually only doing the book together and taking him to all the places where things happened to his story. When I met him, he was severely traumatized. And sometimes in the middle of an interview, he would stand up and he would just run and keep on running until I didn't see him anymore. And then the next day I really thought like, oh, wow, did I do something wrong? Did I ask the wrong question? But he just said he had enormous rage attacks. He had complete insomnia. He couldn't sleep at night at all because he was fearful of his dreams. So we often found him in the daytimes in the office, sleeping on his desk. And it was doing the book that was the final part of his healing process. And once we were done, he really said, this story has helped me to process all that has happened to me. At that time, he didn't have nightmares anymore, or at least not very frequently anymore. And he really said that as an individual, he had healed. So in a way, the book has already served its most important purpose. But yeah, that's sort of in a nutshell, that's what his story is about. It's an absolute incredible story of human resilience against all odds.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing the story of Norman Okello. And ladies and gentlemen, you can find this book on Amazon. It's called The Boy Soldier, a memoir of innocence, lost, and humanity regained in Northern Uganda, written by Norman Okello and Theo Hollander. It actually launched on the 21st of January 2021. So it's very, very new. And we would like you to get a copy to support the work that Theo Hollander is doing, and also to bring awareness to what's happening to children, soldiers, not just boys, but there are also girls who are abducted. And some of them end up becoming sex slaves to the male soldiers and the rebels. Ladies and gentlemen, as we continue to watch this show, I would like you to consider making a donation to organizations such as Interpeace that are doing an amazing work in peace building, and especially with regards to armed conflict in countries such as Uganda and many others around the world. Now, to take us deeper into this, Norman Okello's story is a story of resilience. And as the whole world is going through COVID-19 pandemic, Theo, how can we use the learnings from this to bring healing or to regain our humanity in today's world?
I think Norman's story is, for me, it's a very, very inspiring story, and it has really had a profound impact on me throughout my life. Like whenever, and really, I don't have much to complain. Like I have a life of luxury, a life of comfort, I have a really good life. But whenever I do have anything, like when I do face setbacks, when I do have issues that are not working out, or when I go through a period where things look a little bit more difficult than normal, I just know that like what he survived, what he went through, what he bounced back from and bounced back better from, that means that there is nothing that can happen to me where I can't deal with it either. And I think in the times of COVID, there's a lot of people that really struggling, and for the right reasons. I'm not diminishing people's experiences at all. But I think what his story really teaches you is that whatever happens in your life, you can overcome as long as you believe in yourself, as long as you maintain sort of hope that there is light at the end of the tunnel. And it's not just that you can survive things, you can come out better. Like one of the very last interview that I did with him was a very different interviews from the ones that I did before. And that interview was more around, what are your biggest regrets in life? What is the most meaningful thing that you have ever done? What is, if you could go back in time, you could change anything, what would you change? Like were these types of questions. So it weren't questions about specific situations, but more reflections on your whole life. And the question, like, what do you regret in life? Like his answer was, I actually don't regret anything. Like what happened to me made me who I am today. And I'm happy with who I am today. I'm powerful. I have this experience that I had. He sometimes said, maybe I regret that I had so few choices. But does he regret that he was abducted by the Lord's Resistance Army? Actually not, because he really believes that this made him who he is today. And it shows that, yeah, we can really overcome incredible hardship and come out as better human beings at the end of it. And I also think, like going back to Thomas Coelho's or Dominique Ongwen, who was just indicted by the ICC, it's the same with him as well. Like if he would be given amnesty, he could become a transformed person. He could live a worthy life again. and he was abducted the same way Norman was. And yeah, so I really see that this story offers hope, that people can really survive terrible hardships.
Thank you. People might want to know, where is Norman Okello now?
He's still in Uganda. He's working as a civil servant. And he's doing really well. Like he has his own farm, and his farm is growing. He now has cattle. He has a lot of pigs. Pigs, for some reason, make him very happy because he thinks that they are always smiling. He's doing really well. Like he has a family, he has several kids. Yeah, he's doing really well in life.
Wonderful. We will provide links to a short video that was shot, I believe it's Christian Aid that did this on Norman Okello, and it's just a short clip of what they have recorded of his life, and you will get to see Norman Okello. We'll provide the links below. Thank you so much. As we come to the end of our show today, what message do you have for governments, for the civil society, and for good citizens out there on how to contribute to peace building? As you said before, peace building is simply building relationships.
I think key messages, like if we look at sort of overall aid budgets, peace building is only getting a very, very small percentage. Yet peace building is one of the most important things. Like if you can transform a conflict and build peace, then the developmental impact that will come out of that is much bigger. Like if you can prevent a conflict from happening in the first place, then the humanitarian cost of such a conflict can be prevented. At the moment, there's far more money that goes to humanitarian support than peace building, and humanitarian work is absolutely important. That's work that is saving lives. But ideally, you would want to prevent those situations from happening in the first place. And I think the work that we do with Interpeace, but also other peace building organizations, it really demonstrates that it is possible to build peace. And it is possible to overcome after a conflict has happened and heal societies, as was evident from Norman's story, but is also just evidence from the overall work that we do. So yeah, that would be my key message for governments, key message for people, like for example, people living in Europe. When you're dealing with refugees, when you're thinking about sort of why people flee their own countries, try to place yourself in the shoes of somebody who's a refugee. Like nobody wants to be a refugee. Nobody leaves their country voluntarily. This always comes from situations of great hardship. And rather than trying to close your door and being against sort of development aid and being against, like really taking that approach that this is my country and our borders need to be protected, have a bit of more of an open mind. Try to place yourself in other people's shoes, and also like realize that like we think that we might be living in the most stable countries, but look at what happened in the US very recently. Yeah. Like Syria was a very relatively stable country before it descended into armed conflict, and in 2011, 2010, nobody would have expected that Syria would have been a country that was completely torn apart by conflict. What happened in Syria really can happen in places like the US and other places as well. So who knows, like one day you might suffer the same. So have a bit of empathy and openness.
Absolutely. Empathy and openness is really important. You know, having grown up in Kenya and experiencing the post-election violence, the worst of it that I experienced personally was in 2007, going into 2008. It was just after you had, Theo, you had just come to the organization that I was working with. And I remember it was very terrifying. And for a moment, I imagined if this continued for another 1 week, because we were running short of food, we were running short of water, because the water company and the people who were supposed to, do the processes of water generation and all that, and to supply water, were not at work. The food that we had bought over Christmas was running out, and there was no electricity. We couldn't make phone calls because the lines were down. So I experienced that in Kenya, and while it cannot be compared with what Norman Okello and children soldiers experienced after being abducted, I must tell you, it was one of the most terrifying times in my life. It was very terrifying. So as you talk to refugees, my plea and my prayer is that people have empathy and also help these refugees to reintegrate into their host countries, wherever they find themselves, because they don't have another home. They don't have another home. And I have interviewed former refugees on this show, and they've shared their stories, and it brings me to tears most of the time. During the interviews, we had to stop, and I had to control my emotions because of just the experiences that they have had. And so thank you so much for sharing this with us. In terms of donations and how people can give to organizations such as yours, how does that work?
We get all our funding mostly through governments, through embassies, through development agencies. But it's something, definitely go to our website, interpeace.org. Other organizations that do absolutely amazing work includes MSF, ICRC, Red Cross, Amnesty International, which is an organization that really focuses on individual donations. So all of these organizations, they do very important and amazing work to help people affected by armed conflict, and they can definitely, all of them need your support.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. What last message do you have for people generally about peace building or building broken relationships, not necessarily from armed conflict, but also even, with neighbors and in their homes?
Peace building is my profession, but peace building really is everything in life, and it is about sort of how you build relationships with your neighbors, with everybody around you. It's like I'm not generally much of a pessimist, but if you look at dynamics in the Western world, you really do see a lot of polarization around issues. Like in the UK, you're either against Brexit or you're in favor, and that has become such a big thing that people can almost not live with each other anymore. Or in the US, you are either for Trump or you're against Trump, but there's hardly any middle ground anymore. And my message is, like, try to connect to each other, try to talk to each other about people's differences, try to actively listen to other people, like don't judge, try to understand. Like Norman's story, if like he's done terrible, he's killed people, he's done terrible things, and it's very easy to judge somebody for having done that. But once you listen to him and you understand why he did what he did and what happened before, then it becomes really, really difficult to judge him for what he did. So before you judge people, try to understand them, try to have empathy, try to have open conversations, share information, and try to be together again. We shouldn't be divided because of politics. I think there's too much beauty in the world that connects us. So let's try to be connected instead of divided.
Wonderful. Speaking of connections, how can people get in touch with you?
You can find me via LinkedIn, Theo Hollander. You can find me on Facebook under the same name. So those are probably the best ways. I use LinkedIn the most these days. So please, feel free to reach out to me if you want to learn more about the book. I'd be very, very happy to share if you want to learn more about peace building, also I'd be very, very happy to share.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us for part 2 of today's interview, Peace Building in Conflict-Affected Countries with Dr. Theo Hollander. We invite you to subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on social media. We also invite you to get a hold of The Boy Soldier, a book that is available on Amazon that Dr. Theo Hollander and Norman Okello, a former child soldier, co-authored. Remember, it's all about connecting people, raising funds, and impacting lives globally.